Jeff. How you doing? Thanks for joining me.
Uh, Thank you for inviting me, and I'm doing all right. It's been a rough start to the year, both the Western start to the year and frankly the Chinese traditional start of the year. But personally, not doing so bad, and very glad to be in this conversation with you.
Yeah, same. My life is okay for now, but we are recording this in late January. So our viewers might be able to imagine some of the things that are going on. And I think we'll end up talking, if not directly about that, then about some of the issues that we're grappling with right now, like cultural identity, inclusion, and also maybe the technocracy as well. They seem to be very intertwined
Yes, they
um,
do.
these days. But before we get to all of that, for those who don't know who you are a writer who's been writing for maybe a couple of decades now on popular culture. Um, and I'm sorry, can you make a note, Bren, that we should I'm going to redo that because this is a new computer. I've been only using this for an hour. And so I haven't turned off all the things. Anyway, I'm going to say that again.
Yes, I've made a note.
Thanks. For those of our viewers who don't know who you are, Jeff Yang, you are a writer who's been writing about popular culture for several decades and particularly chronicling the rise of Asian American popular culture, and you're quite well known for that. But I wanted to ask you, by way of starting, how did you develop your interest in culture and this practice of writing about Asian and Asian American culture?
Well, I guess you could say that my interest in Asian culture and Asian American culture weren't synchronous, right? I mean, Asian culture was something I grew up with. I grew up in an immigrant family. My parents are from Taiwan. They came here, had me. I was the anchor baby. They came here legally. These are important things in this day and age because apparently such niceties are now being prosecuted. But uh, when we arrived, I did not, when I was born, rather, I did not speak either English or Chinese, but Chinese was my first language. I was largely brought up by an aunt who sadly has passed away, who did not speak any English. And in fact, my parents rushed me to school a little bit early because they were concerned I wasn't, in fact, learning English. But what that meant beyond simply acculturation and access to the society was that I was exposed to a range of media early on that ended up being really formative in a lot of ways. It just gave me kind of a context for who I was and where I stood in the world that might be a little bit different. And I think that it's not too different for a lot of other Asian children of immigrants or 1.5 generation people who came over as young immigrants. We saw works from our native countries or from the continent of Asia. We saw works that actually centered Asian people and even Asian heroes. We saw things that, as far as the popular culture environment, didn't present us as marginalized, alienated, isolated, or even different, right? So, as far as my interest in Asian culture, I mean, in a lot of ways, that thing which kind of isolates you when you first go to school, that lack of immersion in the mainstream of American culture, because you've been mostly immersed in immigrant culture, right? Ended up being a little bit of a superpower downstream because a lot of the things that I ended up being an early writer about were things that I didn't have to discover. They're things I grew up with. I was watching, you know, dramas from China and Japan and then later Korea at a very young age with my parents. I was watching anime, Japanese animation, as the first animated stuff that I was ever exposed to. For me, I knew it was Asian. I knew it was from Japan. I knew it was translated into Chinese. And I think a lot of people who actually were exposed to these things either didn't have that cultural context or when they received it, saw it as something, again, exotic and outsider and pushed to the fringes of what would be seen as normative in American society, all of which was back then true, right? But by the time the 80s and 90s came along, things started to change. So that's part one. But the interest in Asian American culture, in just identifying and embracing this idea of what it meant to be Asian in America, came when my parents kind of rudely uprooted us from multicultural Brooklyn, which we were living in at the time when they first immigrated, at around, I think it was like 6 years older or so, to Staten Island, another borough of New York. And I should note, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, raised in New York, lived in New York throughout most of my life before another rude transition took me out here to Los Angeles. I'll go into that later. But the the Asian American element came because when we were migrated to Staten Island, I was suddenly surrounded by a community that was almost entirely white. And also, I lived in a neighborhood where the other kids around me made that very clear and plain all the time, sometimes in rough ways. And that sense of all of a sudden being Asian as kind of being like a secret treasure of some sort, right? Something that gave me this ability to connect with worlds beyond, right? The ones that I saw around me was suddenly translated into a space where it felt like a handicap. It felt like something that was a vulnerability. And for quite a while, I retreated in a lot of ways. I kind of pulled back from uh, even identifying as Asian. I refused to eat Chinese food. I remember my parents being very upset about that. Did not want to socialize with other Asian Americans because it felt very much like being a part of spaces where there were other Asians would continue that feeling of being an outsider, but also those spaces felt like they were vulnerable, like they were targetable, like, you know, going to church. We went to an immigrant church. I always had to hide that from my friends because I felt like they would both mock going to church to begin with, but also specifically one that was immigrant Taiwanese. So eh, all these things kind of landed me in a place where by the time I got to college and started to actually meet other Asians who actually came from different backgrounds, but in many cases shared similar roots, similar second generation context to the ones that I grew up with, meant that I had this really interesting opportunity to affirmatively embrace being Asian, right? That this was not simply just an inheritance of my parents' culture, but one where this pan-Asian emergent identity was suddenly being made available to me. And this is, of course, in the late 80s, early 90s, when the very ideas of things like multiculturalism, right, were first taking root. So we were only about a generation removed from the very term Asian American even existing. I was born in 1968, literally the same year that the term Asian American was coined in Berkeley, California. And so by the time I got to college, I sort of synchronistic with the fact that the idea of Asian America was coined at a college campus on the West Coast. I was embracing or engaging with it on the East Coast, and it was very new to everybody still. It was still something we were kind of filling in the lines of. So that experience led me through to first launching an Asian American magazine on the campus of Harvard called East Wind, or relaunching rather, and then it was a newsletter that uh, basically I transformed into an actual publication accessible to the entirety of the campus I was on. But then in graduating, I was kind of emboldened by this idea that like, oh, you can launch a magazine on a college campus. You must be able to do it in the real world too. Forgetting that on college campuses, you actually get financing from a student government. And there are all these other kind of resources immediately available. So despite that, we did launch a magazine called A Magazine Inside Asian America. It lasted for a little over a decade. In the course of that time, grew to becoming the largest Asian American publication in the North American uh, English language space. Uh, and we literally, imploded in a lot of ways for the same reasons why the world is so different today. It was about digital technology, the emergence of social media, and the arrival of another way for people to actually interactively connect with one another despite their diversity and distance. I'm going to pause there because it really cues up another conversation entirely. But suffice to say that in that era before social media existed, I and the people who collaboratively with me launched a magazine, were simply using the platform of a magazine of print and paper, right, as a means to kind of reach out to people who were so distributed across North America that in many cases they didn't have home communities who were also Asian American. The experiences we had of connecting with other Asians on a pan-Asian basis, we wanted to actually expand beyond the limits of a single campus or a single city, and to create something that felt like a more all-encompassing community across America, across North America. And again, we largely succeeded until something replaced the what we were doing, the very inefficient process of what we were doing, with something that was much cheaper and ultimately much more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. You really did cue up where our conversation is going very well. I was also a kid of immigrants. My parents are Caribbean and they also moved from New York City to the suburbs. And I know that feeling of being the outsider and then not having any affirmation of your cultural perspective. But it was in part through the internet that I found a different way into my community and was actually able to find more specific representations that were affirming. In addition to, friends and community, like you said, it's like media is only one part of how we make and understand ourselves. So social media arrives and all of a sudden the kind of the middlemen have been taken out, right? And the costs of distribution kind of get lower so you can reach people much more quickly, efficiently. Um, and you write about this, I think, in your recent book. I mean, there's all these waves of different forms of representation. In some ways, in the 90s, like you were saying, multiculturalism was kind of in. There was also a lot of Black TV in the 90s. Like
Mhm.
corporations were like, ooh, niche marketing. And that kind of set up the context for the early 2000s when you had like blogging and then eventually like YouTube and stuff. So can you talk about like what that shift meant to you and to the culture?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that if we talk about the culture more broadly, uh, meaning American culture, right, or emergent multicultural America, I think that the digital shift really did, for the first time, level certain playing fields. That a lot of the issues we had with representation and with access to media creativity, media distribution, they weren't solved per se, but they were remediated by the fact that with social media, you had a platform finally that could reach around the world, right? That if you were able to, even if you weren't able to actually accrue a gigantic following, there was always the off chance that something you said would be found valuable enough by enough people that it could be sent on the back of, you know, riding the lightning, right? Across the viral landscape. And what that meant, I think, for Asian Americans in particular, uh, was interesting because if you cycle back to what I was talking about regarding finding Asian America on a college campus in the early 90s, or the late 80s, rather, it was something that a lot of people were doing. And that's because there were a lot of Asian Americans on college campuses, right? Those of us who were second generation Asian Americans coming as the children of uh, parents who came in the wake of 1965's uh, liberation, if you will, of immigration, elimination of essentially racially discriminatory nationality quotas, the Hart-Celler Act, meant that there was this burgeoning wave of new immigrants, most of whom came with some human capital. They mostly came with skills and education, and most of them were also looking to settle and not simply to come, earn money, send it back, and then quote unquote go home. So prior waves of immigrants were very much encouraged to leave, right? There was an entire 61-year period of exclusion of Chinese, and later of all Asians. And this 1965 plus wave was the first that was actually encouraged to come and stay, to bring their brains, their human capital, et cetera, to America and enrich it. And our generation of people who came as young kids or who were born here, we were the first ones to not only grow up with this idea that we were Asian American because that term existed and people kept on kind of lumping it together, all of a sudden it was Taiwanese, it was Taiwanese and Chinese and Koreans and Japanese and Indians and Filipinos and lots of groups who don't historically have as much, uh, cultural commonality based on the fact that we all come from different parts of a gigantic continent, and in many cases have historical tension and strife across those boundaries, right? But here we were in America and we were being called Asian Americans. Our parents didn't care. My parents never thought they were Asian American. They were Taiwanese, not even necessarily Taiwanese American, right? But we were being called that. We had to check that off on boxes. When we applied to college, we asked who we were and to volunteer that we apply this particular box, this label. And so you have this multiple, kind of convergent set of forces, right? Of a large cohort of young people coming from a relatively privileged background of immigrants who had the and the you know agenda of making sure their kids go to college. You had those kids going to college just as digital technology was cresting with the personal computer and then the internet and then ultimately social media. And then you had on college campuses across the nation this disproportionately large, well, this significantly large plurality of Asian Americans who were both discovering their identities and discovering the internet, right? What this meant was you have like the University of California system, which had colleges that were 30, 40, even 51% Asian American, even in the early 90s, right? And then you had these people graduating, coming into a world where a lot of them did embrace more traditional professional routes that their parents pressed them towards, but a lot of others just were taking advantage of the freedom that they might have had, that we had perhaps, to rebel against parental expectations and to become creators of various kinds. And the digital technologies that were emerging at that time made that more easy. So social media for Asian Americans in particular was like our superpower. It was a way to punch above our weight. I mean, I use the term superpower multiple times now. Maybe we're actually really super powerful. I don't know. But we we did have that leaning in, I think, to social media in that era from the 90s onwards. Asian Americans were amongst the most successful early bloggers, the most prominent and most followed YouTubers, and then ultimately in spaces like Instagram, Twitter, etc. As Asian Americans, there were entire spaces that were carved out that we were able to occupy, hashtags and conversational spaces that we actually dominated. The same was true for the Black community. Same is true for uh, especially Spanish language Hispanic Twitter, right? Um, it was a new world in which I think affinity and the ability to be passionate about interest was a huge advantage in building following and being able to kind of create the level of interest that established both communities and audiences. And Asian Americans were time-wise just absolutely well positioned to be at the forefront of that.
That was amazing. That's the way you weave together the demographic shift, the policy. I mean, clearly you've written about this and you've talked about this a lot. It makes a lot of sense. And I remember in grad school reading, studies from Nielsen, the marketing agency, saying, hey, Asian Americans are over-indexing on digital consumption and how powerful they were. Even when you go to the early days of MySpace, right? Like Tila Tequila was like the first influencer, the first star, the first social media star. There's a scholar, Lisa Nakamura, who's writing about how we don't give people of color enough credit for really creating the use cases for digital media. Even if you go back to like Asia Avenue and Black Planet and all of that. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, paired question, what was your personal introduction to the power of social media? And also, you know, did you find it to be a superpower yourself? Um, I know that a lot of your collaborators are some of like the key people who kind of really showed that superpower, like Angry Asian Man and Wong Fu Productions, who were instrumental in transforming the film industry. But what was your introduction?
Well, My introduction was as kind of one of the first wave of journalists to embrace social media as a means to engage with readers, to promote what we were doing on print platforms and on digital publishing platforms, and to create a little bit more of a brand for ourselves that was even independent of the platforms we were writing for. And I say that because that's a big distinction, right? I did not create a social media brand for the sake of creating a social media brand. Uh, I started posting on social media because, I mean, for leisure and you know, just general community purposes, I'd been engaged on social media pretty early, but there was a professional dimension that made it kind of increasingly important to be professionally on digital media as a journalist. And a lot of people didn't wake up to that as journalists until a little bit too late, right? But I was fortunate enough to be, again, as Asian American, aware that this platform had just enormous, and not just as Asian American. I think African American and other Black journalists were very early to embrace this. I think people who were LGBTQ very early to embrace social media as a space to, again, build brand and create community and develop an audience, even as traditional media journalists. But being ahead of that curve meant that it it enabled me to, for instance, even as I moved from job to job, right? I started out writing for the Village Voice, uh, a little ahead of social media, really having, feet on the ground. Um, Moved from there to San Francisco Chronicle, where I was a columnist for their then digital platform SF Gate. By then, social media was a real thing, right? And I created a newsletter, but also actively promoted on the platforms available at the time, Twitter and Facebook. And then I was at the Wall Street Journal, where I was writing exclusively for digital platforms, and even there, or especially there, getting people to come to the Wall Street Journal. Like, part of the reason they hired me was because I, by that time, had a brand big enough that when I moved my column from San Francisco Chronicle to the Wall Street Journal, I was able to move an audience with me, right? Despite the fact that those two platforms were so wildly different. So it, at that point, it was like about professional survival and growth. But then something happened, which I think really, be, you know, was transformative in that I actually wrote a column uh, that was perhaps one of the first I wrote to truly go viral and to have kind of a cultural footprint. And it was when Barack Obama was running for president, and this is actually the tail end of my time at the San Francisco Chronicle, actually. When he was running for president, uh, I wrote a column that mused that, much like Bill Clinton was talked about as being the first Black president, even though he was obviously not Black, because of his cultural affinities, because of his background, because of some of the ways in which he embraced the stylings and affordances and affinities that people associate with Black culture, even playing, a saxophone on TV, etc. All that stuff led me to consider whether or not Barack Obama could be seen as the first Asian American president. I was the only person talking about this, but I was the only person with a column where I could actually write about this and then dive deep by actually reaching out to people, just investigating uh, the kind of complex nuances of his background, especially since at the time he was being birtherized. He was actually being othered in a way that Asian Americans found very, very familiar, right? I tried to actually flip that and say it's not just about the negative aspects of being marginalized, exoticized, foreignized, if you will, or enforeigned that matter. It's also the fact that there are a lot of aspects of his upbringing and his way of approaching the world that are informed by an upbringing in Hawaii, the only state in the union which is majority Asian American. Having an Asian stepfather and an Asian American stepsister or half sister, right? uh, spending time in that country, being kind of a third culture kid. There's like a lot of things which just together summed up something really interesting about understanding why Barack Obama was a novel kind of politician, but also somebody who represented a transformative potential symbol, not just for African Americans, but for Asian Americans. And that column went everywhere, right? Um, it even went to the campaign, as I later found out. They were a little hesitant to promote it because they were afraid it was going to draw even more birtherism targeting to them. But when I later met President Obama, um, with my son at the White House, I actually just mentioned offhand, it's like, hey, early on in your first term campaign, I wrote this column that was pretty broadly read, which said that you might be seen as the first Asian American president. And he guffawed, noted that he'd read the column and said, and it's a 100% true. So with that, I feel a little, I don't know, vindicated is not the right word. But my point there is the article was very broadly read, but so too did it attract a large number of people who are not regularly reading my stuff directly on San Francisco Chronicle to my social media presence, right? And all of a sudden I had a following on social media that was significantly larger in a lot of ways than the readership I was getting uh, natively to the Chronicle, which meant that in a way I was giving more to them than they were giving to me, right? As I mean, they paid me, but ultimately it allowed me to migrate to another much larger platform and to bring with it a significant cohort of followers and readers from that other platform to the journal. And yeah, I mean, I think it was just that notion of being able to create an audience or community that is transportable, that is mobile in that fashion was a really interesting one. And I think it was during a time when a lot of younger journalists, especially, were preemptively building those platforms even before they were hired by traditional media and were being hired by traditional media because they had those communities, those cohorts with them.
Yeah, you're really describing the power of especially that early social media moment to like connect people, and people really gathered around who and what they loved and what affirmed them as their identity, which is so much of what fueled, I think, Obama's rise as president in many ways. And we can talk a little bit more about that because I think the outgrowth of that is the growth of diverse representation that we saw in the latter half of the 20 teens and early 2020s that included Asian Americans, I think, for the first time in a big way in Hollywood movies, but also many other different kinds of identity, Black people, trans people, et cetera. But I also want to get to the backlash to that, which we are currently living through, it seems.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, as you've talked to people, as you've done your writing, as you're on social media, um, are you seeing a backlash? And if so, what are the ways that digital technology is not serving us in the way that it used to?
There's a tremendous backlash, but there always kind of has been, right? People back in the era of blogging and traditional digital media, if you will, digital platforms, always used to say, never read the comments, right? You post something, ignore the comments. Social media is only comments. Social media is like if you took the comment section and then just emptied it out on your head, right? And I think relatively early in that journey of having a social media following that was sizable enough to be able to kind of direct traffic, I found myself on the other end of that. There was this social media moment where individuals were utilizing followings and hashtags to actually direct mob traffic to people who sort of stepped out of line or whose opinions they disagreed with. And there was a moment when I was in the middle of that. I wasn't the only one, but it made, I think it was this beat where people started to realize that the toxicity and um the sort of denial of service attack element of social media was going to be a problem, right? A real problem. And I think that for Asian Americans, that problem is twofold. One is uh, if you are an Asian American voice who has established a presence on social media because that's kind of all you had, right? It was the first place you were able to establish a visual and vocal presence to simply speak your mind and to be heard. We didn't have much access to traditional media. Very few of us were in a position uh, to reach wide audiences. Social media was the first place for a lot of people where that was possible. It meant that this kind of toxic mob attack and even just general feedback, the sort of like ratioing, right, that occurs on social media when you're disagreed with was particularly painful, I think, to early Asian Americans on social media. It was even true for Asian Americans who weren't really on social media, but who nevertheless had social presences because of traditional media. And I'm going to use the example of my son Hudson, right? Who was at the time like an adolescent kid on this television show fresh off the boat, never acted in anything before, uh, came home one day, announced he wanted to be on TV. I, I sort of went along with it for him because although he'll deny it, he was trying to impress a girl. And, it's your job as a dad to try to give your kid some wings. And he unaccountably not only got called back, but then ultimately cast, and the show ran for 6 seasons and kind of pivoted Asian American visibility in entertainment significantly, especially because one of the cast members in particular, Constance Wu, became the star of a movie called Crazy Rich Asians, which really did kind of change everything, right? And I just remember that in the period in which he was acting on the show, I was both contending with brigading aimed at me because I continued to write, and I was writing more about politics because I was conflict of interest limited from writing about entertainment. And then he was getting attacked because people saw this, cute, chubby kid on social media, or sorry, on traditional media, and decided that the easiest way to critique him was to go on his mostly unvisited social media presence that, obviously he was too young to manage himself and dogpile, right? So it was kind of a dark moment. And I think that in general, marginalized people were not well served by security and moderation in that era. Um, the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s. Uh, Things as a result did change, right? There was a lot more investment made in moderation, in trying to clean up some of the sewers of social media. But now we're in a day in a place where all that has been stripped away for all intents and purposes. Um, but then there's the other side of it, which is this. When you are somebody who has never been heard before and you have the ability all of a sudden to be heard by a lot of people who actually will follow you, there's that temptation to be the brigader, to be the person who would kind of lead hashtag armies against folks. And I think we saw a fair amount of that as well. Um, so the other disservice is, I think, uh, you know, you hand this superpower to people who've never really had it before, don't have guardrails in how it's utilized, don't manage the ways in which people are allowed even to manifest this thing. It rapidly becomes weaponized. And I think a lot of people have been harmed as a result because of these things, not just in the Asian American community, by other Asian Americans, but more broadly in marginalized communities.
Yeah, I think that it's been a real eye-opener how much technology can influence our discourse, how we talk to each other. Even if it's not even about racism per se, just the way that the platforms love to privilege extreme emotions, um, has really just kind of evacuated just people being able to talk to each other in real life in a lot of ways. And so I'm curious, um, what are the challenges that you think we're navigating in this moment, and it's like we're in such a new moment here in January 2025, where a lot of these platforms have decided that they're not going to fact check, right? Or they're not going to spend as much money on moderation and safety and protection because they don't need to. Then we have AI bots who also just auto publish things. You know what are you concerned about in this current moment?
Well, I think that there are some obvious elements of concern related to the ways in which the platforms that Asian Americans and other groups that don't have broad-based, on-the-ground movement uh, infrastructure, right? That don't have organizing infrastructure, all of a sudden find themselves in, right? We became very dependent on social media, not just as a means for communication, not just as a means for broadcasting our voices and our creativity, but also as a means to connect and network and to respond to things, to engage in advocacy and activism. And now that these platforms have been upended, right? Both the protections, but even some of the tools, even some of the ways in which we're able to use them to build this sort of digital infrastructure have been broken. We're finding ourselves in a situation where we've put a lot of eggs into this basket, and all of a sudden, you've seen the price of eggs these days, right?
Yeah.
So what it really means is that you got a lot of people who are having to make really dicey choices. Like I had at peak close to 60,000 followers on Twitter, right? Before it became X. When Twitter became X and it started changing so rapidly, I could not, in good conscience, continue to engage in that space. And not just a lot of the people who I used to engage with there, but a lot of the influential individuals who I was able to interact with directly via that platform were sealed off, right? All of a sudden, there wasn't this direct ability to back channel and talk to politicians, talk to celebrities, talk to notables. Uh, and it impacted me professionally as well because a lot of journalists and a lot of people who are uh, leaders or thinkers or perceived as such often got communicated with through these sort of de facto sliding into the DMs back channels. And Twitter was the number one space for that to occur, right? When you did something, said something, reacted to something on Twitter, all of a sudden, enough people were watching that people might invite you to participate in that conversation at a higher level on, broadcast or other television, uh, writing for the biggest possible platforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Speaking engagements, everything, right? So that was all kind of scythed away almost instantly by leaving behind that platform. Uh, and it's not just me. Again, so many other people have faced the same thing. Either you stay at the Nazi bar, right? Or you move on, but all the folks who you got to know at the bar before it went Nazi, you're leaving them behind because we're all going to different bars now. That's a huge thing. I mean, it's a lot more than I think a lot of people think about. The disaggregation of communities that has occurred because of the stigmatization and fragmentation of platforms has been gigantic for marginal communities that didn't really have easy other ways to congregate. Beyond that, I mean, I think that we've seen the sort of poisoning of the well when it comes to I'd say two forces. One is very much obvious and something that's been commented on ad infinitum, which is that as Asian Americans on social platforms, we're buffeted a lot by it, sort of the geopolitics of it all, right? As somebody who has a face that looks like a Chinese person or who has relatives in China and in Taiwan, when things happen there, they happen everywhere and they happen to me and to people I love, right? When COVID, right, engineered this toxic rhetoric aimed at Chinese people, no one knew the difference or cared that I and a lot of other people who are Asian American were being attacked, both online and in public, physically sometimes, because of that resemblance or that perceived affinity. And that's dangerous. I mean, I do think that social media has absolutely been used as a tool to craft a certain level, a certain kind of racist, nationalist, uh, and I mean, I wouldn't even call it populist. I mean, it's really just sort of, yeah, it's racialist propaganda that has become so much a part of the air that the internet breathes now. And it makes it almost impossible to not find yourself in conversations where that ends up being a pollutant in the discourse. The second beat is a little bit weirder. Such a huge percentage of internet content and social media content these days comes from bots, some of which are engineered by foreign powers, actually from China, actually from Russia, right? And places like that, but also from commercial sources that are simply trying to lever some of the worst instincts and uh, agendas of the internet, uh, that in a way that slop, that sort of toxic soup of uh, I'm not sure how to refer to it exactly, but I would, I guess, call it Orientalist imagery aimed at targeting people who have a taste for Orientalism has just become rampant, right? A lot of it is sexual. You see all of these um, bots advertising porn or escorts, etc., that have polluted lots of these platforms. Originally, it was just X, Facebook, even LinkedIn, right? But now it's even on places like Blue Sky, even on places like Threads. You'll see like you have 50 new followers who are Asian, but then you look closely, and 30 of them are, just avatars that are generated by AI, enticing you to click on various kinds of, wild services, right? And it just makes it so that it's harder and harder to discern who's actually Asian and who actually has something to say. And
Yeah.
it gets worse because we're now in an era where we're moving from social media as the primary denominator in some ways of discourse and shared information, and more towards AI. And AI is training itself on this slop content. It's training itself on this vast pool of Orientalist imagery and language that it pervades social media platforms, pervades digital platforms, to the point now where you cannot, as a woman, create an AI avatar. An MIT researcher actually shared this in the MIT Technology Review, right? You can't, as an Asian woman, create an AI avatar without 90% of the things being suggested to you looking like they are, you know, scantily clad, busty, anime infused, you know, sexual avatars, right? Sexualized avatars. So there's this accelerant process that occurs with technology, whether you're talking about digital platforms, social media, and now AI, and whatever's next, that tends to concentrate on the things that are already there, distill them, and then proliferate them. And we've seen that again and again and again in each of these spaces as they become more exploited, bigger, more commercially available, and more open to the kind of darker side of human nature. Again, it's for everybody's impacted by it, but because the percentage of people who are Asian American, the percent even on social media, is so much smaller, we're disproportionately harmed by it because all of a sudden a majority of us are not real, right? And certainly not something that we would encourage people to follow. I mean, again, LinkedIn. How many of the people who claim that they want to connect with me on LinkedIn now are some sort of, artificially generated AI entities that are trying to scam me? It's just gigantic, and it's made the platform unusable for me, right? but that is also true increasingly about other digital platforms and social media platforms as well.
Yeah, what you're like, you really laid out a whole host of issues that are interconnected. I heard in the beginning the kind of the loss of the public square, the kind of uber public square that social media originally was, where like the regular person could talk to the person in power and get something changed. And that kind of became more of like something like a gated community, right? Where people who were othered were suspect and like, you don't belong here kind of energy. And now we're in something else where it's kind of like not safe to go outside almost. Um, I when you were talking about the proliferation of bots and the ways that race and gender create these kinds of stereotypes, it reminded me of Sophia Noble's discussion in her book Algorithms of Oppression, where this is over 10 years ago now. She Googled black girls and immediately it was like porn. And she was right next to her, like her niece, and it was like the kids are seeing this. And it was the same for Asian girls, obviously, right? And other identities. When I was teaching that, I did, because it was a few years later, I did hashtag those identities. And it was a little safer on Instagram. But what was interesting is that when I did hashtag Asian girls, I actually did get pornography. And that was on Instagram, which, kind of made its name about being cleaner than Twitter and some of the other platforms. So like there's a specific form of like misogyny towards Asian and Asian American women that I think you're highlighting here that these platforms have just not addressed, even though Google did eventually address the Googling problem because that was a liability concern for them. It seems like now with AI, it's like, well, just the bots are doing it. So there's nothing we can do. And it does change the vibe, right? It's no longer the town square, the public square where you feel free to be you. It's like you're watching out and you're suspicious and you're scared. So, that was a pretty dark picture we painted. Um, but I'm wondering if you have any way forward, like if you could start from scratch, if someone gave you X or Meta, um what would you do differently? Are there any like traditions or ways of being with people even in your own life that you think
Mm.
these platforms can adopt?
Mm. I think that a lot of the challenge here is that the costs of running these platforms is gigantic, and the resources necessary to make them work, because they're all based on, for all intents and purposes, the attention economy, right? How many ads can we feed? How often do they surface? Who's willing to pay for those ads? That inherently breaks the system, because I mean, an old quote at this point, repeated a million times. But when you don't know what the product is, you are the product. Social media, you are the product. We are the product on social media, and the incentives that creates are inherently bad when it comes to those aspects of social media that we, I think, most cherish, which is to say that town square, which is to say civil discourse, expanding our horizons, cultural connection, community connection. None of those things are monetizable in the same way for advertising purposes as empty engagement, as AI slop, as clickbait, right? So just acknowledge first and foremost that the fundamental business model that social operates on inherently creates bad affinities and incentives. So how do you fix that? Well, you got to change that business model. That's the first thing, right? You got to figure out some way to make money that isn't simply about harvesting clicks, harvesting hours of wasted time flicking, right? Paying for social media, I think a lot of people might be open to that if the payments were small, if there were some ways of infusing micropayments, but not in the clunky and annoying way that I think frequently they've been engaged. Maybe there's some room to kind of cross-pollinate the subscription economy we've seen in things like Substack, uh, in things like Patreon, into social media in a way that leans more to the social media side, the conversation side, and less to the creativity and work side. Again, that would require some real thinking in terms of what the checks and balances there might be. You want enough public, enough engageable, accessible stuff so that people can create big audiences, but then you want some sort of tariff, some sort of means of paying for the platform that hopefully both provides benefit to the people who are creating the engagement, the content, or the engagement, but enough value to the people who are following that they'll keep on doing it, right? So there's a lot of alchemy of A/B testing, a lot of innovation that has to happen to even see whether there's a future way to make something like that work. You've got things like Blue Sky, you've got things like even Threads, which have not yet monetized because they haven't quite figured out the best route to do so. You've got things like Mastodon, right? The Fediverse and other federated platforms that don't even have monetization schemes because they're operating primarily on essentially like a tip economy, right? For those running servers, and they're distributed. So you lose one server, hopefully you can move to another one without a problem. All that said, um, these are kind of technological solutions to a problem that I think isn't just about business models and technical requirements and specs. The bigger thing is this. I mean, we're training entire generations of people to be really, really bad at this, really to have really short attention spans, to not be critical thinkers or critical consumers of media, to assume that the first thing they're presented with is truth. I'm feeling lucky, right? And to then share it instantly as broadly as possible. And I find myself, even as somebody who has been a journalist my entire adult life, falling prey to that. I think a lot of journalists have as well. You're in this place now where the standards and practices don't exist, right? And the incentives are such that you want to be fastest, first, and loudest. And sometimes that means you step on yourself. And when you do, the internet doesn't forget. You can't roll back what you've already put out there. It's it's the whole problem with headlines running on and news stories running on page one, corrections running on the back page, right? Except on the internet, it's even worse. It's whatever's first out there is the thing that 80% of people will then instantly subscribe to, and any iterations therein afterwards often get drowned out by that mob. So we have to actually go to the consumers. It's not going to be enough to actually change platforms. We have to find ways to, at the level of education, really lean into it and invest in teaching people to be better critical thinkers and consumers. And that's a gigantic lift. It's maybe even bigger than building entirely new platforms. But I don't see how we get out of this simply by making some things verboten or harder to do, or creating moderation mechanisms to stop people after the fact. You need people to be more skeptical, but also be more optimistic and hopeful and be kinder. And all that requires starting way earlier than when they actually sign into a public social platform.
Yeah, as a media professor, I'm constantly amazed that, we don't teach media before college, and so
Yeah.
kids grow up swimming in media and no space to process like what they're seeing, what's going on. And I think that's like a huge issue. But I think what you're also saying is that there's like a deeper kind of cultural shift that has to happen, especially here in the United States. But this is also a global phenomenon where we, yeah, are just not kind to each other. um, and Dana Boyd, who's a scholar of youth and social media, will say that
I love
the
Dana.
kids. Yeah, so she writes that like a lot of the problems with social media are just that kids don't have a place to go in their real lives, so they're on social media because we've closed down so many youth friendly spaces in cities and towns for all kinds of really complicated reasons. And so that might actually fix our problem. But I want to ask you, because you've already answered it too. So if you have anything new, great. If not, that's also okay. What is one thing you would change about what's going on platforms right now? If you could just flick a
Mm.
switch and say, no, let's just not do that, or yes, let's do this. Um, and or what's one thing that's still working for you that you still love about going on social media?
Well, maybe I'll translate that a little bit into some features that I actually really like about this next generation of Asian. Oh, sorry. Let me rephrase, not Asian. uh, well, let me rephrase that a little bit or interpret that a little bit more as what are some of the features that I'm seeing in the next generation of social platforms that I really like, that I think have the potential as we hopefully start building a different way to consume media of at least ameliorating some of the problems we're facing. I think that some of the stuff which I'm really, really liking, and I've been fortunate enough, I think, to be a part of some of the thought leadership or the research for some of these companies that are deeply embedded in some of this stuff, like Meta back when, to help guide them towards making some of these choices, right? And I see stuff like on threads, for instance, you can disappear posts, hide them not just from yourself, but from your followers that are toxic or that are racist or otherwise uh, harmful, and essentially it's nip in the bud that kind of brigading. I mean, it's very difficult in some ways to constantly be identifying where some of these emerging attacks might be coming. And if there are enough of them coming, as sometimes occurs, it's impossible to just spend 24/7 all of your time there clicking away the hate, right? But sometimes it's enough to simply just hide from one instigator, one original trigger point to put out a fire before it really starts, right? So that ability to curate your feed and what you and your followers see, I think is really important. I think a step beyond that is what Blue Sky has been doing with actually allowing people to create custom feeds, right? And allowing people to create things like starter packs where you can define your environment, both the kinds of people you want to hear from and talk to and follow, as well as the kinds of stuff you want to see based on many more specific, dials to turn or switches to flip than ever existed before, right? The biggest problem, I think, with Twitter and with a lot of other, really all the other platforms that existed in the prior wave, the prior generation of social media, is that you couldn't really customize your feeds at all. You could kind of curate by saying, I don't want to see this post or post like it on a one-to-one basis. But then you're sitting there and you're just, again, doing this tiresome training effort of your own feed. And it doesn't always work because the way those algorithms work is they don't want you to be able to successfully fully train your feed. If you could only see what you like, then they don't have the potential to share things with you that expand your horizons to incorporate stuff that can make better money on, right? So there's always going to be that synchronicity, serendipity tension between stuff you know you want and stuff you don't know you want, but you might like. And the more you get stuff you don't know that you want, but that you might like, the better it is for the platforms. Now, what they want to do is they want to feed you stuff that they like, right? That they're going to make more money on. But with custom feeds and starter packs, you actually have the potential to get serendipity, exposure to new people, new voices, new content that nevertheless is guardrailed by yourself, by the things that you actually do find that you have some interest in, or the communities you do want to belong to. And I think that's really quite important. I will say that the one thing has not been cracked yet, and I wish I could change, right, is to create some sort of mechanism for safe space engagement between people who are from polarized ends of political spectra or who have just differences of opinion in a way that is much more low risk, that prevents some of the potential for, again, mob activity from occurring. And I'm going to actually point to a non-social media, or at least social network entity as kind of a very interesting set of experiments around this. On YouTube, there is a channel called Jubilee, right? Jubilee Media. I happen to know the founder, was an early person to kind of encourage them when they first started. They began as kind of this feel-good, optimistic bring us all together type of a channel. But then as things got rougher and more toxic, they started to lean into this idea of like, well, we can't just say nice things in the world all the time because the world is not always nice. But maybe we can create an environment where different sides of the world can engage in a space that at least is bounded by certain kinds of rules of safety or a format, right? So you'll see a lot of this stuff, viral clips from, they've got this thing called Surrounded, right? Where it's one blank against 30 other people who have a very different opinion,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Essence.
And they have other kinds of similar formats where they're bringing together people with very significant differences, but forcing them into a certain kind of discourse that is intended to be again guardrailed and bounded. I feel like something like that is possible on social networks, right? But again, it's one of those things of, well, where's the incentive? Why would you do this? What money can you make from something like this? And in something like YouTube, that stuff is much more monetizable than in spaces like, um, like these social platforms that are mostly designed around presentment of feeds, right? But I think it's possible. And I think that people can actually invent on the fly ways to utilize existing parts of these services to create these things in a de facto sense. And maybe one of the most interesting examples of that was during COVID, when on Instagram, uh, African American musicians, just in the hip hop world, created Versus, right? This curated set of kind of head to head musical discursive conversations based on playlists, right? That ended up creating a new form of content that kind of didn't exist before, at least on those platforms. It really became huge because we had nothing else to see, but it also became something really interesting. And ultimately, I think once people were released into the general population, it was harder to maintain because again, there wasn't as much of a pressure to be a part of that. You could go see whoever you want without exposing yourself to other entities. But it reminds us that resourceful people will find ways to make best use of the platforms they have and to hijack tools if need be to fill needs that exist but aren't served already.
Yeah, what I was hearing a lot of what you're saying is like platforms that encourage people to become active and critical consumers and participants in media, right? Like choose your own feed, curate what you see, or be intentional about how you engage with people in this space. Those examples of Verses and of Jubilee kind of remind me of the classic root of hip hop, the circle where people are just going at each other, but in a spirit of play, right? Like there's a kind of one-upmanship of like, I can rap better than you, and everyone's all around them encouraging, but then at the end of it, they shake hands, right? And how can we create platforms that where people understand these kinds of more cultural protocols of like, this is about good sportsmanship or this is about being a good neighbor, right? As opposed to this is about becoming famous and making lots of money and destroying your enemy. So I think that you've really given us some really great frameworks to think about throughout this entire conversation. So really, thank you for bringing your wisdom. Um, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Likewise, thank you. It's been very enjoyable, and thank you for giving me, I don't know, an hour to vent. I
Anytime,
appreciate it.
anytime.
Thank you. Thank you.